Chapter 16. Freedom from Government. Most people seem to think of the government as an all-powerful giant with unlimited resources, superpowers of control and surveillance, and the ability to keep every citizen in line. Such impressions are reinforced by movies and TV dramas that picture government agents calling upon vast resources of information and manpower to bring any criminal or dissenter to bay. And the impression is probably enhanced by newspaper accounts of crackdowns on narcotics rings, smuggling activities, and tax frauds, in which the government has used large numbers of agents to break a case. All this can be pretty intimidating, but it has very little to do with your relationship to the government. For one thing, the government has limited resources, just as you and I do. When a large number of agents are utilized to break a narcotics ring, that leaves fewer people to police the average marijuana smoker. And when they marshal their resources to crack $1 million tax fraud, that leaves less manpower to look after the normal individual tax returns. If the government were as powerful as people seem to think it is, the war on drugs would have been won long ago. Crime wouldn't be such a national issue, and the government's grandiose social reforms would be successful. As it is, however, none of these things is true, because the government can't force many people at once to act in ways they don't want to. The government is one big group trap. To be efficient, it depends upon millions of bureaucrats whose incomes and careers don't depend upon efficient action. The people who operate the super-secret spy agencies are simply human beings, with ulcers, family problems, inter-office memos to answer, staff meetings to attend, girlfriends to see when they can sneak away from the office opponents to outmaneuver, and the constant interference inherent in any bureaucracy. The government is an inefficient, bureaucratic mess. It isn't surprising that its programs always turn out to cost more than expected, that it almost never successfully completes a project, that bombers bomb the wrong cities in Vietnam, that it's usually trying to rally its citizens to be patriotic and sacrifice to compensate for the government's mistakes. In the book 1984, George Orwell pictured a totalitarian society that has become the standard view of the total state of the future. Everyone's life was controlled by computer, and there was a TV camera in every room to monitor everyone's activities. Fortunately, such dramas overlook the fundamentals of economics. The larger the government, the less efficient and productive it is. Slaves don't produce with the enthusiasm, incentive, and imagination that free people do. Bureaucratic programs just don't work as intended. So while a totalitarian state may include a TV camera in every room, I doubt that the camera will even work. 3 principles. The first principle in dealing with government is don't be awed by it. What little the government achieves is almost always due to the voluntary participation of its citizens. Those who don't want to help the government can go their own ways without running into much trouble. The second principle is don't confront the government. A sure way to make your life miserable is to attack the government head on. Its resources are limited, and it can't waste them tracking down every possible violator of every law. But it will certainly aim its power at anyone who publicly defies it. So keep to yourself, do what you have to do. The third rule in dealing with government is don't organize. Don't get a large group of people together to defy tax laws, promote ways of circumventing the government, or openly violate regulations. By joining protests, you might wind up in jail, and you won't have much freedom in there, will you? Mass campaigns are also easy targets. That's where the government is likely to devote its limited resources. When many people are doing the same thing, it's easy to stop them by passing laws or by applying existing laws against them. When you act alone, however, you're usually not worth the trouble. your power. When you act alone, you can flexibly do whatever is necessary to stay ahead of the government. If new laws are passed, you can change your methods to continue doing what you want to do. No cumbersome, bureaucratic government can move as fast as an individual who is determined to stay ahead of it. There are limitless possibilities for avoiding government, without crisis, court battles, or fear of being jailed. Start by listing the governmental restrictions that inhibit your freedom. Determine the possible consequences of ignoring them. It may be that no more than a warning is involved if you're caught, and you might also find that there are legal ways of avoiding the restrictions, if they are important enough to be worth the time to investigate. In many cases, you can just ignore the law without incurring dangerous consequences. In others, you may have to go to more trouble, such as consulting an attorney or tax accountant. But act for yourself. Don't organize, and don't look to leaders to help you. Any activity big enough to require a leader is big enough to be noticed and attacked. Legal evasions. For most people, there are more than enough loopholes available to be able to operate freely without running afoul of the law. More than anything else, it simply requires the determination to do so. For example, I know of a company that operates successfully in spite of governmental regulations. The state in which it's located has been trying to license it for 5 years, and a federal agency has been trying to shut it down for violating a regulation. The state legislature even passed a special law to bring the company under its jurisdiction. But to this day, the company still operates in its own way, pleasing its customers and making profits for its owners. They have moved flexibly and easily into a different method of operation every time a ruling has been made against them. They have had to pay attorneys' fees, but those are insignificant compared to the profits they would have lost had they given in to the bureaucrats. I once had a similar experience. I was operating a small business in California, burdened with payroll taxes, bookkeeping requirements, and other regulations imposed by the government. There were Social Security taxes, unemployment insurance taxes, disability insurance taxes, and income taxes to be paid or withheld. They cost me money and time, and they reduced the take-home pay of my employees. I regularly received notices from an organization whose purpose was to end payroll taxes. They requested funds, of course, and they also wanted me to join a protest movement to quit withholding taxes once the membership was large enough to be intimidating. Naturally, I didn't get involved. Instead, I fired all the employees, including myself, and made contracts with each person for his services. Since I no longer had any employees, I no longer paid or withheld payroll taxes. No bureaucrat called on me to find out why the revenue to the state had been lost. Meanwhile, the protest movement died its inevitable death, and other employers continued paying payroll taxes. The employees of my company received an additional benefit. They were now independent businessmen, selling their services to me, so they could designate their homes as their offices, coming to my office to perform services for me. As a result, each of them had far more tax deductions. He could claim as business deductions part of his household expenses, telephone bills, utility bills, car expenses, and other things that are normally considered to be personal expenses. Even with no income tax withheld, very few of them owed anything in taxes at the end of the year. None of them bothered to file quarterly tax estimates, and none of them ran into any trouble from the Internal Revenue Service. The simple change from employee status to that of independent contractor resulted in lower taxes for everyone concerned. It's a small and common example, but there are probably millions of people who could use that loophole and don't. It's well known that there are thousands of millionaires who don't pay income taxes. Some of them avoid property taxes as well. Occasionally, there's a hue and cry about it in Congress, but no effective changes are made. No tax law could be written short of 100% confiscation, that wouldn't have numerous loopholes. As one loophole is closed, another opens up. Part of the reason may be that congressmen don't like to pay taxes either. Some people evade taxes by changing their citizenship and or by operating personal holding corporations through tax-free countries. If you make $25,000 or more a year, it's probably worth looking into this. Others move to countries with more favorable tax structures. Did you know, for example, that writers, artists, and other creative people are exempt from income taxes in Ireland? The laws provide loopholes that allow individuals to establish personal, tax-free foundations that receive all their income and pay for their personal expenses, without the money being taxable to anyone involved. Unfortunately, a group of people tried to organize this method into a mass movement about 5 years ago, which resulted in offsetting legislation, but the loophole is still used. Inheritance taxes can be legally avoided too. Sometimes it requires only that property be co-owned or transferred prior to death. The important thing is to avoid the normal post-mortem legal processing of an estate. There are a multitude of ways to legally avoid taxes. I can't list them here, or that would defeat their purpose, and you won't find them in magazine articles about taxes. Much of the information in those articles comes straight from the booklet that accompanies your tax return. But once you're determined to cut your taxes, you should be able to find the best ways for yourself. Other restrictions. The same principles apply to other governmental restrictions. If you just stay out of the normal channels of doing things, you can avoid conflicts with the government. Licenses and regulations can be avoided by using a little imagination. There are plenty of psychologists who are unlicensed and unregulated because they don't call themselves psychologists. And there are plenty of people who do the same things that teachers, doctors, architects, lawyers, beauticians, engineers, bankers, investment counselors, and psychiatrists do, but avoid all the legal requirements by not using the legal title. Such things as courtroom battles, jury duty, and the draft are ways by which the state can drain your time and money. But there are always ways to avoid each of them. Many people avoid court procedures by having separate arbitration contracts with business associates, private marital agreements without getting legally married or divorced, or appointing third parties to hold funds or arbitrate disputes without the normal legal expenses. Jury duty is typical of the impositions the state can make upon an individual. Many people avoid it by simply not registering to vote. Since jury lists are called from voter lists, those people are never bothered. If voting is important to you, that may not be the way to do it. But I quit voting 10 years ago and haven't missed it in the slightest. There are numerous legal ways to resist the draft. There are even many organizations that provide that assistance. If I were vulnerable to the draft, I would check with those organizations for techniques. But then I would consult an attorney to be sure that the loopholes hadn't been closed by the organization's own activities. If you want to avoid taxes or regulations, there are always ways to do so without being vulnerable to bad consequences, no matter where you are. No matter what government you're dealing with. No matter where you are or what government you're dealing with. Legally or illegally. Sooner or later, you will have to make a decision regarding your willingness to obey laws. There's a normal reluctance to break laws. You can easily feel that you are contributing to the decay of your country or that you're making yourself vulnerable. However, there are thousands of once rich Cubans who today wish they had been willing to commit the crime of sending their funds out of Cuba before the government confiscated them. They either thought they were helping their country by keeping their funds at home, or they counted on laws they thought would prevent confiscation, or they didn't want to take the risks involved in smuggling their funds out. Their views have been shared by people in countries all over the world. People who always thought, it's different here. They fail to realize that no government obeys laws. It will change overrule, ignore, or defy them whenever they get in its way. To count on the law to protect you is a grave mistake. Recognize also that you undoubtedly break laws continually. It's almost impossible to drive a car without breaking traffic laws, and most other kinds of laws are filled with contradictions that make nearly everyone a lawbreaker just by going about his own business. To determine whether or not to break a law, the only consideration should be the consequences to yourself. What is the risk involved? What would happen if you're caught? How much are you gaining by breaking the law? As you evaluate those consequences, don't overlook your own emotional nature. Don't do something that will make it impossible for you to sleep at night. The money saved may not be worth the anxiety. But don't be swayed by considerations of patriotism, law and order, or national solidarity. Those things are only slogans designed to further the government's interests at the expense of your own. In my case, I have had to handle things legally. By writing books like this one, I forego the anonymity that would allow me to have more flexibility. I have chosen to write books and obey the laws because the books increase my income enough to make the choice profitable. Your decision will be based upon considerations appropriate to you. Even if you do things legally, it's still best not to advertise what you're doing. Often, the legality of a technique is determined arbitrarily by a tax collector or a judge. If you flaunt your activities, that could influence a decision against you. And when a loophole is publicized enough, the government may move to close it. Illegal methods. If you're considering breaking a law, check first to determine the legal consequences. It may be something that involves no fines or penalties, but it could also be something very costly. You should have that information before you act. For most things you might want to do, there's probably little danger. All you need to do is check the consequences and then go ahead and do it. A typical example of this is a regulation that prohibits American citizens from owning gold. Many people are upset about it, and movements have been organized to pressure Congress to legalize gold ownership. Meanwhile, plenty of Americans go ahead and buy gold anyway. Some of them do it legally by taking advantage of the loophole that permits ownership of gold coins, but others buy gold bullion without making a fuss about it. Several foreign bankers have told me that many of their American clients own gold bullion, and none of them have ever been harassed or prosecuted by the U.S. government. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, no American has ever been fined or sent to jail for owning gold. If the gold is kept outside the country, it can't even be confiscated. The few cases of governmental action have been against large companies, where millions of dollars worth of gold were involved. Taxes can be evaded in many ways, too. Some of those ways are risky, but many of them involve very little chance of disclosure. I imagine that many individuals make sure that they receive a good part of their income in cash, and then report only enough of that to justify their general living standards. The rest is salted away somewhere. And I'm sure there must be thousands or millions of people who have never filed an income tax return. They probably work in ways that eliminate the need to have taxes withheld or the need to have a social security number. Many people use foreign banks to handle their financial affairs in ways that won't be reported in the U.S. Others simply cheat on their returns in ways that don't involve penalties. These and other methods will continue to be profitable so long as the people who use them don't try to get together and organize their activities. A little research can uncover a wide variety of avenues of tax evasion. Then there are all the little irritants of governmental regulation: compulsory schooling laws, zoning laws, licenses, etc. If you gripe about them or campaign against them, you probably won't get anywhere. But use a little imagination and they don't have to control you. For instance, Karl Hess decided he didn't want to attend high school, despite the compulsory schooling laws. So, he registered at 2 different schools, then filled out transfer slips from each of them. Authorities at each school assumed he was at the other, and no one ever bothered him about it again. There are many, many private schools operating now in many parts of the country that aren't legitimized by various state compulsory schooling laws. I know of one in which all of its 300 students are legal truants, and less than one half of its teachers have legal credentials. But its high academic results have made the school practically impervious to prosecution. If you want to start a new business, don't go looking for all the licenses and regulations you're supposed to get. Just operate. Try to arrange your business so that you can contact your prospects without public fanfare, and you may never come to the attention of the authorities. But if you do, the worst that could happen is that you will have to do what you would have done at the outset anyway. Dealing with government. At some point, you may need to decide whether or not it's in your self-interest to deal directly with the government. Accept subsidies, sell to the government, buy from it, or work for it. Such decisions are purely subjective, and you have to decide in a way that's comfortable for you. In my own case, I have decided to avoid the government as much as possible. I use government roads and the post office because the government has declared monopolies in those fields, and that makes the alternatives many times costlier. But I have decided against accepting normal subsidies like free schooling, healthcare, mortgage guarantees, etc. In general, government services are usually of very low quality. I often wonder if no education might not be better than some of the free education I see. Most people agree that you can't get something for nothing, and yet I think they might also assume that what they get from the government doesn't cost anything. There's always a price to pay, however. Even a thief who thinks he's obtained his haul cost-free won't give any of it without wanting something in return, and that goes for the government as well. Government services involve obligations, red tape, and the need to put your name on a list as a grateful recipient of the government's favors. The gifts are always presented with plenty of strings attached. I don't want the strings, and I don't want to depend upon something that may be taken away from me tomorrow. I don't think that most people recognize the strings and the prices. And part of the problem may come from thinking that money is the only cost to be considered. Abby Hoffman's book, Steal This Book, lists hundreds of ways of getting free goodies from the government, along with ways of cheating companies. But in most of the examples she cites, you have to exert devious, risky, and involved efforts to get the supposedly free benefits. For most people, it would be far less costly to pay the normal market price of the stolen benefits. My life has been less cluttered so long as I simply avoid the government wherever possible. I find it easy to accept and pay normal prices as they occur, without wasting a great deal of time trying to circumvent the price by dealing through the government. And I see no reason to wage war against the government. Its employees are simply doing what each of them thinks is best for himself, just as I'm doing for myself. Our methods may differ, but each of us is seeking his own happiness. So I see no reason to be indignant over new or old laws, no reason to campaign against injustice or inefficiency, no reason to waste my life fighting something that's always been here and probably always will be. How you will deal with the government will be up to you. My observations have been mentioned only to illustrate the kinds of decisions one needs to consider in evaluating his relationship with the government. Your cooperation. Governments invariably call upon their citizens to cooperate in efforts for the public good. They want you to sacrifice to help solve economic crises, foreign trade problems, and military conflicts. But these things were caused originally by the government intervention. Even so, the calls can seem compelling, and social pressure can build on behalf of patriotic efforts. I don't believe you do anything for your country by fighting in a war giving up your money, or sacrificing in any way. The national economy is a typical example of the government trying to solve a problem of its own making. During the past few years, the American dollar has been sinking in international exchange. The economy has revealed critical problems, and inflation has proceeded unchecked. Politicians and economists would like you to believe that these problems are caused by gold speculators, greedy businessmen, powerful labor unions, or weak regulations. They are not. They are the direct result of governmental interference in the economy. And any citizen who rallies to the government solution by rejecting his self-interest is making a futile sacrifice. No matter how the problems are explained, it is important to deposit your money in a foreign bank while you still can. It is important to withhold as much as possible of your money from taxes. The economy will go in its own inevitable way, regardless of what you do. But at least you can protect yourself. There's no reason for you to go under if the government does. Whatever the issue, whatever the government's program, whatever the public acceptance, you can always accomplish more for your own life by withholding your support and using your resources on your own. But do it quietly and anonymously. There's no reason to make a public issue of your views that won't accomplish anything. Freedom. It's not hard to be free of government, so long as you concentrate upon the direct alternatives available to you. It requires only a little initiative and imagination. It may seem difficult if you engage in political action to try and change what you don't like. You may feel quite helpless if you think you must convince everyone that things must be changed. But the objective of freedom is quite realistic. Only the methods have been wrong. Don't be awed by the government. Don't confront it directly. Don't organize. If you act on your own, legally or illegally, there's a great deal you can do to be free of the government. And there's no reason to feel ashamed, unpatriotic, wicked, or guilty about it. What you do to support the government contributes nothing to your own welfare, nor the welfare of society. What you do for yourself at least contributes to the happiness of one very important individual. I like the way that Lysander Spooner put it. Whoever desires liberty should understand these vital facts. 1. That every man who puts money into the hands of a government puts into its hands a sword which will be used against himself to extort more money from him and also to keep him in subjection to its arbitrary will. 2. That those who take his money without his consent in the first place will use it for his further robbery and enslavement, if he presumes to resist their demands in the future. When you withhold money from the government, you're acting as you would when you lock your home at night to protect it against thieves. In either case, you are acting to preserve what is yours from those who would like to take it without your consent. And just as you can easily protect your home by using a watchdog, the right locks, or a burglar alarm, so can you protect your funds and your freedom from the government, if you will direct your attention towards that goal. The savings can be tremendous. If you need any incentive, determine how much you've paid in taxes for the past year, or 5 or 10 years. Then make a list of all the things you could have bought with that money. The freedom is yours. The money is yours. The freedom is yours. The money is yours. The opportunity is yours. Once you turn your attention towards yourself. And your purpose will be as noble as any person could find, the advancement of your own happiness.